The rain had already ruined her hymn by the time she reached the hedge gate, and Eleanor Whitmore decided, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has run out of good choices, that she did not care. Behind her, the lights of Ashcombe Hall glowed gold and merciless through the storm, throwing long yellow rectangles across the wet lawn. And somewhere inside that enormous house 100 candles were being lit for a ball she had not been invited to attend, only to work. She was not a guest. She had never once imagined herself a guest at a house like Ashcombe Hall. She was here because her aunt's failing eyes could no longer manage fine needlework, and because the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, had taken pity on a woman with a good hand and no dowry, and had hired her to mend 3 dozen napkins and repair a torn hem on Lady Faircliff's gown before midnight. It was, Eleanor told herself firmly, honest work. It did not matter that her own gown, 3 seasons old and carefully retrimmed, would never see the inside of that ballroom. It did not matter that she had walked the last mile from the village because she could not afford the carriage fare twice in 1 week. What mattered was the horse. She heard it before she saw it, a low, frightened sound, more groan than whinny, coming from the direction of the home paddock, where no one ought to have been at this hour, in this weather, with the storm rolling in over the hills like a judgment. Eleanor was not a foolish woman. She knew that a well-bred young lady, had one existed in her circumstances, would have hurried on toward the servants' entrance and minded her own business. But she had grown up on a farm before her father lost it, and she knew the sound of an animal in pain. And she found that she could not simply walk past it into the dry warmth of the house, while something suffered in the dark. She found the horse first, a great black hunter, tangled in a snapped lead rope, one leg caught against a fence post, eyes rolling white with terror. And then, a moment later, she found the man. He was on his knees in the mud in evening dress of all things, a black coat that must have cost more than her father's farm had ever earned in a year, utterly ruined now, soaked through and streaked with filth, and he was speaking to the horse in a low, steady voice that did not match the wildness of the storm at all. "Easy," he was saying. "Easy, Corvus. I have you. I have you." He did not have the horse. The horse was thrashing, and the rope was tightening, and in another moment the animal would break its own leg trying to free itself. And the man's hands, though careful, were shaking with cold or fear, or both. "You're doing it wrong," Eleanor said. She had not meant to speak so plainly. It was not the kind of thing one said to a gentleman in a ruined coat, not even in an emergency. But the words were out before she could soften them, and there was no time to regret them now. She was already crossing the paddock, already pulling her shawl free of her shoulders. He looked up at her. She would remember, later, how strange that first look was, startled and almost affronted, as though no one had corrected him in a very long time. And then, to his credit, he did not argue. "Then tell me the right way," he said, quickly. "Cover his eyes." Not his nose, his eyes. He's fighting because he can see the rope and the fence, and thinks he's trapped forever. If he can't see it, he'll stop fighting long enough for us to work the leg free. He did not hesitate. He took the shawl from her outstretched hand. His fingers, she noticed, were bare. He had lost his gloves somewhere in the mud, and he laid it gently over the horse's eyes, murmuring the same low words as before, and almost at once the great animal's thrashing eased, the wild rolling eyes stilled beneath the wet wool, and its breath came less like a scream and more like a sob. "Now," Eleanor said, already kneeling in the mud herself, heedless of her gown, "hold him steady. I'll free the leg." It took several minutes, her fingers numb, the rope swollen tight with rain, the horse trembling under the man's hands. But at last the loop came loose, and the horse staggered back a step, favoring the leg but sound, blowing hard through its nostrils, no longer screaming. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain came down around them, indifferent, and the golden windows of the great house glowed on, utterly unaware that anything at all had happened in the dark. "You knew exactly what to do," the man said. He was still kneeling, still holding her ruined shawl, looking at her now with an attention that made her suddenly conscious of her wet hair, her muddied hands, the state of a dress that had never been fine to begin with. "I grew up with horses," she said simply, "before we lost the land." Something moved behind his eyes at that. She could not have said what, only that he seemed, briefly, to be looking at her rather than merely seeing her, the way a man looks at a ledger that will not balance and knows, suddenly, precisely where the error lies. "You're hurt," he said, nodding at her hand, where the rope had torn a shallow line across her palm in the struggle. "It's nothing. It is not nothing." He said it with a flatness that brooked no argument, and before she could protest he had drawn a handkerchief, somehow still dry, tucked inside his ruined coat, and pressed it into her palm, folding her fingers over it with a care that felt entirely out of proportion to the size of the wound. "Hold that. Tightly. You needn't trouble yourself. I only came to see to some mending for the housekeeper. I ought to get on. In this?" He glanced at the sky, which showed no sign of relenting. "You'll take a chill. I have taken worse for less reason, sir." She rose, brushing uselessly at her ruined skirts, and something in her tone, not unkind, but entirely unimpressed, made the corner of his mouth twitch, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, gone again almost before it arrived. She would think of that, later, how briefly it lasted. How rare it must have been, for it to vanish so completely, as though the muscles of his face had forgotten the shape of the thing. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eleanor," she said, and then, because it seemed the kind of night that called for full honesty, "Eleanor Whitmore." "Mr. Ashcombe," he said, and did not offer more than that. No title, no estate, no mention of the great house glowing behind them. And Eleanor, who had no particular reason to doubt a man kneeling in the mud in a ruined coat, took him precisely at his word. A steward's son, she assumed, or perhaps a cousin of the family, called in for the ball and pressed into some errand involving the horses. It did not occur to her, why would it have, that a duke might be found alone in a storm, hatless, gloveless, kneeling in the mud over a frightened animal, with no groom, no footman, no one at all to witness it, but a seamstress who had wandered too near the paddock. "Well, Mr. Ashcombe," she said, "you ought to get that horse dry and warm before the chill sets into him. And yourself besides. Good night." She did not wait for his reply. She had napkins to mend and a hem to repair, and precisely 1 candle's worth of time left before Mrs. Pruitt began to wonder where she had got to, and she told herself, quite firmly, as she hurried up toward the servants' entrance with her ruined shawl left behind in a stranger's hands, that this had been nothing at all. A small kindness to a frightened animal, a conversation with a man she would very likely never see again. She was wrong about that, though she would not learn how wrong for several days yet. The Duke of Ashcombe did not attend his own ball that night, a fact that caused a great deal of muttering among the assembled guests, and no small amount of relief in the Duke himself, who stood at the window of his study for the better part of an hour after the horse had been seen to, watching the lit windows of the ballroom below and listening to the distant muffled sound of an orchestra he had commissioned, but had no intention of hearing up close. Gideon Ashcombe had not smiled, truly smiled, the kind that reached the eyes and stayed there, in something over 3 years. His household knew this the way one knows the weather, an unremarkable, permanent fact of the landscape. His mother had stopped remarking on it after the first year. His sister had stopped trying to coax it out of him after the second. The staff had simply adjusted, the way staff always adjust. learning to read his moods in the set of his shoulders rather than the shape of his mouth, because his mouth told them nothing at all. He had smiled, once in the mud, at a mending woman who did not know his name and had called him, quite correctly, wrong. He found that he could not stop thinking of it. It was not her face, though her face was not unpleasant to think of. Dark hair come loose from its pins, a strong jaw, eyes that had looked at him not with the deference his rank generally commanded, but with the brisk, unimpressed assessment of someone determining whether he could be trusted with a task. It was not her voice, though her voice, too, lingered, low, direct, entirely without the studied softness the young ladies downstairs employed when addressing him. A softness he had come, over the years, to find nearly unbearable, so thick with calculation that he could taste the ambition behind it before a word was even spoken. No, what he could not stop thinking of was the ease of it, the way she had simply corrected him, without apology, without simpering, as though his rank, whatever she believed it to be, was entirely beside the point when a horse was suffering, and something needed doing. No one corrected him anymore. No one had, in a very long time. He rang for his valet, changed out of his ruined coat, and went down, eventually, to stand at the edge of his own ballroom for the appearance's sake, greeting his guests with the same flat courtesy he had worn like armor for 3 years, watching young women in silk and pearls angle themselves into his line of sight with the same patient, practiced calculation he had grown so tired of that he had nearly stopped seeing it as calculation at all, and had simply begun to think of it as the ordinary shape of a room full of women. He did not see Eleanor Whitmore again that night. She was, at that hour, 3 floors above him in a small sewing room off the servants' hall, her ruined him forgotten in her lap for a full minute, while she pressed a stranger's handkerchief, finer linen than she had ever owned, with initials embroidered in one corner that she did not think to examine closely, against the cut on her palm, and told herself, quite firmly, that she was not thinking of the way his voice had gone gentle for a frightened animal, or the strange, brief break in his composure when he had almost smiled, and then had not. She finished the mending. She walked home in the rain. She did not think, particularly, that she would see Mr. Ashcombe again. She was wrong about that within the week. Mrs. Pruitt came to her aunt's cottage on Thursday with an offer that seemed, at first, too strange to credit. The household required a woman with a steady hand and an understanding of horses to assist the head groom, whose own hands had been badly burned in a stable fire the previous winter and had never fully recovered their strength. The pay was generous. The work was honest, and, Mrs. Pruitt added, with the particular delicacy of a woman delivering information she did not entirely understand herself, it had been specifically requested that the position be offered to Miss Whitmore, by name, on the recommendation of a member of the family. Which member? Eleanor asked, though something in her chest had already begun to suspect. I couldn't say, miss. The instruction came through Mr. Harlow, the steward, and he had it from higher up than himself. That's all I know. Eleanor took the position. She told herself it was for the wages, which were true and needed, and for her aunt's sake, whose eyes grew dimmer by the season, and not at all because some small, foolish part of her wondered whether she might, in the course of her duties, encounter a certain Mr. Ashcombe again. She encountered him on her 3rd day, in the stable yard, in bright autumn sunlight this time instead of storm dark, and she very nearly did not recognize him, not because his face had changed, but because everything around it had. He stood with 2 liveried grooms deferring to him with a stiffness she had not seen in the mud, and old Harlow the steward bowed his head when he addressed him, and the great black hunter, Corvus, nickered and pushed his nose into Mr. Ashcombe's palm, with the easy familiarity of an animal greeting his own master. His own master. Eleanor set down the bucket she was carrying, rather more carefully than the moment strictly required, buying herself a breath, a beat. in which to arrange her face into something that did not show the sudden lurch of understanding moving through her. He saw her a moment later, and this time, when their eyes met, there was no mistaking the flicker of something, not embarrassment, precisely, but a kind of wary awareness, the look of a man who has been caught in a small deception and is not yet certain whether it will matter. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the grooms around him went very quiet, because it was not usual for His Grace to know a stable hand's name, let alone speak it aloud in that particular tone, careful and low, as though testing how much weight it could bear. "Your Grace." She said it evenly. She did not curtsy over long, nor did she stammer, though her heart was beating with an unpleasant, thudding insistence that she resented rather more than she resented him. "I did not know, the other night, that I was giving instruction to a duke. Would it have changed your instruction?" "No," she said honestly, "but it might have changed how I gave it." Something in his face shifted at that, not quite the almost smile from the paddock, but close to it, a loosening around the eyes. "I preferred it as it was." "Then perhaps you ought to have said so at the time, sir, rather than letting me walk off thinking I'd been lecturing a steward's cousin. Would you have believed me if I had told you the truth in the mud?" She considered this with the same brisk honesty she brought to everything. "No," she admitted. "I don't suppose I would have. Then I have done you no disservice," he said, only postponed an inevitable correction, and this time the almost smile held a full second longer before it vanished again, folded back into the careful blankness that, she was coming to understand, he wore the way other men wore a coat, deliberately, and because the alternative left him too exposed, he did not linger. A duke did not linger in a stable yard in conversation with a groom's assistant, whatever the temptation, and he was gone within the minute, leaving Eleanor to finish her work with her thoughts considerably less settled than they had been an hour before. She told herself it changed nothing. She was still a woman without a dowry, mending hymns and mucking stables to keep her aunt fed through the winter. He was still a duke, with a name older than the county itself, and 100 women in silk waiting for the smallest crumb of his notice. The distance between them had not shrunk merely because she had once told him he was holding a rope wrong. She told herself this several more times over the following weeks, with steadily diminishing conviction, because the Duke of Ashcombe had developed, she noticed, a peculiar habit of finding reasons to be in the stable yard whenever her duties brought her there. It began, always, with some ordinary pretext. He wished to see how Corvus's leg was healing. He wished to discuss the purchase of a new hunter with old Harlow, and somehow the discussion always seemed to require Eleanor's opinion as well, offered first reluctantly and then, as the weeks passed, with an ease that surprised her. He asked her, one grey October morning, why she thought the bay mare favoured her left foreleg on wet ground, and listened, actually listened, weighing her answer with the same seriousness he might have given a physician's opinion. While she explained what she had learned from her father, years ago, about stone bruises and soft hooves, and the particular treachery of English mud. "You speak of your father as though he taught you a great deal," he said. "He taught me everything he had left to teach, before we lost the farm. It wasn't much of an inheritance in the end, not the kind that shows up in a will. It is not nothing," he said, echoing, without seeming to realize it, the very words he had used over her wounded palm weeks before, and Eleanor found she had to look away, briefly, at the way that small correspondence settled somewhere just beneath her ribs. He did not ask about her circumstances with pity. That, she came to understand, was the thing that undid her defences most steadily. More than his rank or his solemn, guarded handsomeness, or even the rare flashes of dry humour he permitted himself when he judged the danger of a smile sufficiently contained. He did not look at her reduced circumstances and see a tragedy to be managed. He looked at what she had made of them. A steady hand, an unromantic competence, a refusal to flatter or fear him, and seemed, increasingly, to find it more interesting than anything the ballroom had offered him in years. "You never ask me why I don't smile," he said to her one afternoon, apropos of nothing, while they stood together at the paddock fence watching Corvus graze. Eleanor considered this. "I assumed you had your reasons. Most people assume I am merely cold, or proud, or that dukes do not trouble themselves to smile at grooms and seamstresses. Are you? Cold, I mean, or proud?" "I don't know any more," he said, and something in the plainness of it, the lack of performance, made her turn to look at him properly. "I was neither once. I am told I laughed a great deal, as a young man. I don't entirely remember it." "What happened?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer. The wind moved through the paddock grass, and Corvus lifted his head, ears swiveling, then dropped it again to graze. "My brother died," he said finally. 3 years ago this winter. He was meant to hold the title, not I. I was the second son, and glad of it, and I had a life of my own I was rather fond of. Then he drowned crossing a flooded ford he'd crossed 100 times before, and within a season I had his title, his debts, his tenants, his mother's grief, and no earthly notion how to carry any of it. I stopped smiling somewhere in that first winter. I have not found the way back to it since. I am not entirely certain the way back exists." Eleanor did not offer him easy comfort. She had learned over the weeks that he did not want it, that he flinched, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but she had learned to see it, from the practiced sympathies other women offered him, the soft hands and softer words that asked nothing of him but his gratitude. She said, instead, grief doesn't usually leave the way it arrived. All at once, I mean. It tends to go the way water goes out of a soaked field, slowly, and only if there's somewhere for it to drain to. He looked at her for a long moment. "And where is a duke meant to find somewhere for it to drain to?" "I couldn't say," she admitted. "I'm not a duke, but I imagine it's difficult to find anywhere to put a thing down, when everyone around you is too busy bowing to notice you're carrying it." Something moved through his face then that she had not seen before. Not the almost smile, but something rawer, more startled. The look of a man who has been examined truthfully for the first time in longer than he can remember, and does not know, yet, whether he minds it. "No one has said that to me," he said quietly. "In 3 years. No one has said anything so plain." "Then perhaps no one plain enough has been standing near you," she said, and this time, when the corner of his mouth moved, it did not vanish so quickly. Winter came on, and with it came a closeness between them that neither named aloud, because to name it would have required acknowledging a truth that both of them, for entirely different reasons, found easier to leave in the shadows. He began to seek her out beyond the excuse of horses, a book left, apparently by accident, on the mounting block where she was certain to find it, with a passage marked that seemed to speak to some conversation they had left unfinished the day before, a basket of hothouse fruit sent to her aunt's cottage with no card attached, though the household staff, who saw everything and said little, knew precisely whose hand had ordered it. She began to look for him too, though she would have denied it fiercely if pressed. She found herself lingering a few minutes longer at the paddock fence on the mornings, when his horse was saddled for a ride, in case he should pass that way. She found herself thinking, at odd hours, of the particular gravity of his voice, the way he weighed his words before spending them. So unlike the careless chatter of the young men who occasionally passed through the village and paid her the kind of empty compliments she had long since learned to distrust. It was in December, on a morning of hard frost, that he found her in the small library adjoining the estate office. She had been sent to mend a set of curtains there, and had paused, unable to help herself, over a shelf of books she had never in her life expected to touch. and he stood in the doorway a long moment before she noticed him, watching her with an expression she could not read. "You may borrow anything you like," he said, when she startled and began to apologize. "I would rather my books were read than merely dusted." "I wouldn't presume, Your Grace." "You presumed to tell me I was holding a rope wrong, the first night we met," he said. And there it was again, that flicker at the corner of his mouth, familiar now, almost fond. "I confess I find your presumption rather more welcome than most people's deference." She set the book down, carefully, and turned to face him fully. There was something in the quality of the morning light, grey and clean through the tall windows, that made the moment feel unusually exposed, as though whatever passed between them now would not be easily taken back. "You should not say such things to me," she said quietly. "It isn't kind. To either of us." "Why not?" "Because I am a groom's assistant with a torn hem and no dowry, and you are the Duke of Ashcombe. And there is precisely one place this can go, and it is not a place either of us would wish my aunt to hear spoken of in the village." He crossed the room, not quickly, not with any impropriety, but with the deliberate steadiness of a man who has thought a great deal about a decision before making it. "I have not asked anything improper of you. You don't need to ask it. It sits in the room whether either of us speaks it or not. Then let me speak it plainly, since you are so fond of plain speech." He stopped an arm's length from her, close enough that she could see the fine lines of tiredness around his eyes, the particular stillness he held himself in, like a man perpetually braced against something. "I do not know what I am offering you, Eleanor. I only know that I have not laughed. Not once, not truly, since my brother died, until the night I knelt in the mud and a woman I did not know told me I was doing everything wrong. And I have not stopped thinking of that laugh, or of you, in the months since. That is a dangerous thing to tell a woman in my position. I am aware," he said, "that it is dangerous for you in ways it will never be dangerous for me. I am aware that if this goes wrong, you bear the greater cost of it, and I do not say any of this lightly, or without having turned it over 100 times in the dark. But I find that I have run out of patience for pretending I do not think of you." Eleanor's heart was beating very hard, and she was aware, with the part of her mind that never entirely stopped calculating risk, of everything this moment threatened: her position, her reputation, the fragile respectability she had built so carefully to protect her aunt from further ruin. But she was aware, too, of something else, something that had been building quietly for months in stable yards and library corners, and beside paddock fences in the cold, that she believed him. Not because he was a duke, and dukes were owed belief, but because he had never once, in all their months of acquaintance, said a single thing to flatter her. Everything he had ever told her had cost him something to say. "I am not offering you an answer today," she said finally. "I need to think of my aunt. I need to think of what happens to a woman like me if this is only ever a winter's fancy for a man like you." "That is fair," he said, and something in his face, relief perhaps, that she had not simply refused him outright, softened the guardedness she had grown so used to. "Take whatever time you need. I am not going anywhere. I have, it seems, become rather attached to this stable yard." For the first time since she had known him, he smiled, not the brief vanishing flicker she had grown used to cataloguing, but something fuller, something that reached his eyes and stayed there, transforming his whole guarded face into something she had not quite believed she would ever see. She found she could not breathe properly for a moment looking at it. "There," she said, when she had recovered herself. "That is the thing I've been waiting 3 months to see." "Then perhaps you had better keep correcting me," he said, "since it seems to be the only thing that produces it." But the world outside that library did not pause to allow them their slow unfolding. And what neither of them yet knew was that the peace of that winter would not last the season. It was the Dowager Duchess, Gideon's mother, a woman of formidable composure and an even more formidable network of correspondence, who first raised the matter, not with Eleanor, whom she had not yet troubled to notice, but with her son. Over a dinner in early January that Eleanor heard about only second-hand, from Mrs. Pruitt, whose sympathies by then lay rather more with the groom's assistant than with propriety. They say she asked him outright whether he meant to make a fool of the family, Mrs. Pruitt reported, low-voiced in the sewing-room, whether he understood what it would mean, a duke courting a stable girl. "Begging your pardon, miss, I don't mean it unkindly, only that's the word her grace used, and worse besides. She reminded him he has cousins circling the title now his brother's gone, and no direct heir yet secured, and that any weakness, any scandal, would be seized on. She's not a cruel woman, mind, only a frightened one, and frightened people say cruel things." Eleanor absorbed this with the same steady calm she brought to most difficult truths, though it cost her more than she let show. She had known, of course, in the abstract, that a duchess would object to her son forming an attachment to a woman who mended napkins for her living. She had simply not yet had to feel the particular, personal weight of that objection landing on her own shoulders. She did not see Gideon for nearly a week after that, whether by his design or simply the press of estate business, she could not say, and pride kept her from seeking him out to ask. When they did meet again, in the stable yard on a bitter bright morning, there was a new strain in his face, a tiredness that had not been there before, and she understood, without being told, that the dinner had happened, and that whatever had been said had cost him something. "You've heard, I expect," he said, without preamble. "I've heard some of it. My mother is not wrong to be afraid. There are cousins, Reginald chief among them, who would be glad of any excuse to whisper that I am unfit for the title, and a scandal involving a stable hand would hand them precisely the excuse they need. My brother's death already left the succession thinner than it should be. I understand what my mother fears. Do you share her fear?" He was quiet a moment too long before answering, and that pause told Eleanor more than any words could have. "I fear losing you more than I fear Reginald's whispering," he said finally. "But I would be lying if I told you that pressure means nothing to me. I have spent 3 years learning that a duke does not get to want things simply because he wants them. I have learned it rather thoroughly." "Then perhaps," Eleanor said, and she was proud later of how steady her voice remained, though something in her chest had gone cold and small, "you had better learn it a little more thoroughly still, and let me go before either of us is any more foolish about this than we already have been." She turned to leave. He caught her wrist, not roughly, but with a sudden urgency that stopped her more effectively than any grip could have. "I did not say I would let you go," he said. "I said the pressure means something. It does not mean I intend to yield to it. Give me time to manage my mother and my cousin, and this title I did not ask for, and do not always know how to carry. Do not mistake my caution for cowardice." "How much time?" "I don't know," he admitted, and it was, perhaps, the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "I have never done this before. I have never wanted anything badly enough since my brother died to have to learn how to fight for it." The winter deepened, and with it, so did the difficulty. It was not one dramatic blow that nearly ended them, in the end, but a slow accumulation of small cruelties. A cousin's pointed remark at a county gathering, repeated back to Eleanor by a village girl with poorly concealed delight. A letter from the Dowager Duchess to Eleanor's aunt, icy and correct, suggesting that a respectable family would do well to discourage a connection so plainly unequal, and so certain to end badly for the party with the least power to protect herself. A rumour, planted by Reginald's own hand, though no one could ever quite prove it, that the Duke had ruined a servant girl and meant to pay her off rather than marry her. A rumour that spread through the village with the particular speed such rumours always find. It was that last rumor that broke something loose in Eleanor, that she had, until then, held very carefully in place. She confronted him in the library, the same room where he had first spoken plainly to her, and her voice, when she spoke, shook with an anger she rarely allowed herself. "They are saying I am your mistress, that you mean to pay me off and marry some earl's daughter once you've had your winter's amusement. Do you understand what that does to a woman like me? I cannot simply weather that the way you can weather a cousin's gossip. My reputation is the only thing of value I own outright, and it is being spent without my permission, for your family's convenience." "I know," he said, and he looked, she thought, genuinely wretched, older than his years in the grey winter light. "I have been trying to find a way to answer it that does not make things worse. My mother believes that if I simply distance myself from you publicly for a time, the rumor will die of its own accord, and no lasting harm will. Your mother believes that because it costs your mother nothing." Eleanor said, "It costs me everything. Do you understand that difference, Gideon? Do you understand that you can retreat into this house and wait for the gossip to pass? And I cannot. I have to walk through that village every day. I have to sit beside my aunt in church every Sunday and watch the other women decide, in real time, whether I am a fallen woman or merely a fool." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, the careful, guarded weighing of words gone, replaced by something rawer. "You are right. I have been a coward, dressing caution up as wisdom. I told myself I was protecting you by moving slowly, and instead I have let you stand alone in the middle of a fire I lit. What do you mean to do about it?" "I mean," he said, to stop being careful. What he did 3 days later, he did in front of the entire county. The occasion was the 12th night assembly at Ashcombe Hall, the first grand gathering the Duke had hosted since the ball on the night Eleanor had mended napkins in a back room and found a stranger kneeling in the mud, and every family of consequence for 30 miles had been invited, including this time, at the Duke's explicit and much remarked upon instruction, Miss Eleanor Whitmore and her aunt. She had nearly refused to attend. It was Mrs. Pruitt, in the end, who talked her into the borrowed gown, a soft blue silk that had belonged once to a cousin of the housekeeper's who had married well and outgrown it, and into the carriage that carried her, trembling with a nervousness she despised in herself, up the long drive toward the same golden windows she had once seen only from the dark of a storm. The room went quiet when she entered, not all at once, but in a slow, spreading ripple, heads turning, voices dropping, the particular silence of a crowd that has been waiting, with cruel anticipation, for precisely this moment. She saw Reginald Ashcombe near the punch table, a thin smile already forming, and she saw a cluster of young ladies in silk, exchanging glances that needed no words to translate. She held her chin level and did not run. Gideon crossed the entire length of the ballroom to reach her, not hurrying exactly, but with a directness that left no ambiguity about his purpose. And the crowd parted before him the way crowds always parted for a duke, though this time every eye in the room understood precisely where he was walking, and precisely why. "Miss Whitmore," he said, loudly enough to carry, and bowed to her with the full formal courtesy due a woman of rank, rather than the abbreviated nod he might have offered a groom's assistant. "I am glad you came." "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the whole room could hear it. "I understand," he said, still pitched to carry, still watching her rather than the room, though he was plainly, deliberately speaking to every ear present, "that there has been a great deal said this winter about the nature of my regard for you. I find I am tired of allowing others to narrate a story that is mine to tell." He paused. The room had gone utterly silent now, silent enough that Eleanor could hear the fire crackling in the great hearth at the far end of the hall. I have known Miss Whitmore since the night of my brother's memorial ball, when she found me alone in a storm, mishandling a frightened horse, and told me, without the slightest deference to my rank, that I was doing it wrong. She was correct. She has been correct, in fact, about a great many things I did not wish to hear, in the months since, including, I now believe, my own cowardice in allowing this family's fear of scandal to keep me from saying plainly what I mean to say now. He turned fully to face her. Somewhere near the punch table, Reginald's thin smile had entirely disappeared. I do not care what this room believes it knows about my character, or hers, Gideon said. I care only that everyone present understands, without ambiguity, that Eleanor Whitmore has my whole regard, my whole intention, and, should she consent to have me, which I have not yet had the honor of asking her properly, and do not intend to ask her here, in front of an audience she never invited, my whole future. What passed between us began before either of us knew the shape of the other's rank, and I find that the knowledge of it since has changed nothing in me but my patience for pretending otherwise. The silence that followed was, for a long moment, absolute then, from somewhere near the back of the hall. An older woman, a baroness of considerable age and even more considerable disregard for fashionable opinion, began, quite deliberately, to applaud, and the sound spread through the room in slow, uneven waves, not universal, not without its holdouts, but enough, more than enough, to break the spell of judgment that had held the assembly since Eleanor's arrival. The Dowager Duchess, standing near the fireplace, did not applaud, but nor, Eleanor noticed, did she leave the room or turn her face away, and there was something in the older woman's expression, not quite approval, but something adjacent to it, a grudging, complicated respect, that Eleanor understood, even then would take time to grow into anything warmer, but would grow, nonetheless. He did ask her properly, 3 days later, in the paddock where it had all begun, with Corvus grazing nearby, and no audience at all but the winter sky, and a robin that had no interest whatsoever in the proceedings. I have been thinking, Gideon said, that I owe you a proper accounting, before I ask you anything else. You were right, in the library, when you said the cost of this falls unevenly between us. I cannot undo that. I can only promise you that I understand it now in a way I did not, when I was still telling myself that caution was the same thing as wisdom. I know, Eleanor said. I watched you learn it, in front of the whole county. Then you'll know I mean this as plainly as I have ever meant anything. He took her hand, bare this time, no gloves for either of them, the same hand she had once bandaged with a stranger's handkerchief in the mud. I do not love you because you are pretty, though you are. I do not love you because you flatter me, because you have never once flattered me in your life, and I find I have grown entirely unable to trust anyone who does. I love you because you told me I was wrong, the very first night we met, and because you have gone on telling me the truth ever since, at whatever cost it has been to you, and because somewhere in the course of that truth, telling I found my way back to a version of myself I thought my brother's death had buried for good. You gave me back my own face, Eleanor, the one that still knows how to smile. That is a very fine speech for a man who claims he doesn't know how to court anyone. I have had a great deal of practice failing this winter. I thought it best to learn from my mistakes. And there it was again, the smile, full and unguarded, no longer rare at all, warming his whole face until she could hardly remember the closed, careful stranger who had knelt in the mud all those months before. Will you marry me, Eleanor Whitmore? Not because I am a duke, and duty demands I settle the succession, though God knows my mother would be relieved if you'd let her believe that's the whole of it, but because I cannot any longer imagine a version of my life that does not include you correcting me, at length, for the rest of it. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the man he had been in the mud, and the man he had become in the ballroom, And the man standing before her now, entirely unguarded, entirely hers if she chose to have him, and found that the answer had been settled in her, quietly, for longer than she had let herself admit. "Yes," she said. "Though I warn you, Your Grace, I have no intention of stopping the correcting, married or not." "I would be disappointed," he said, drawing her close, "if you ever did." And this time, when he kissed her, there was no storm, no mud, no audience of frightened animals to interrupt them, only the pale winter sun over the paddock, and the quiet, settled certainty of two people who had found their way, slowly and honestly, from distance to devotion, and meant now to stay there. They were married in the spring, in the small village church, rather than the grand cathedral in town, at Eleanor's quiet insistence, and Gideon's immediate, unhesitating agreement, and the Dowager Duchess, who had spent the intervening months coming to know her son's chosen wife rather better than she had expected to, wept through the whole ceremony, and later claimed, with some indignation, that it was only the pollen. Eleanor's aunt sat in the front pew, in a new bonnet that had been, this time, entirely and unapologetically a gift, and cried without any pretense of blaming the flowers, at all. And in the paddock, on the morning of the wedding, before the carriages arrived and the whole business of a duke's marriage swallowed the day whole, Gideon led Corvus out for one last quiet ride alone with his bride-to-be, the two of them walking the horse slowly along the same fence line, where a stranger in the mud had once been told, quite correctly, that he was doing everything wrong. "Do you remember?" Eleanor asked. "The handkerchief?" "I have it still," he said. "I never returned it, if you'll recall. I kept meaning to, and then I kept finding reasons not to. You might have simply told me, that first week, that you were the Duke." "I might have," he agreed. "But then I would never have known, with any certainty, that you cared for the man rather than the title. I have found, since, that certainty of that kind is worth almost any amount of mud." She laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and he watched her with the particular, quiet wonder of a man who has learned, slowly and at some cost, that the best things arrive not with fanfare, but with patience, and honesty, and the willingness to kneel in the mud and be corrected. "Everyone bows to you now," she said, the same as they always did. "Yes," he said, taking her hand, lacing his bare fingers through hers exactly as he had that first stormy night, though nothing between them was frightened any longer, nothing between them uncertain. "But you were the only one who ever asked me why I didn't smile. I find I have been trying to earn the right to answer that question properly, every day since." And when he smiled at her then, in the clean spring light, it was not the brief vanishing flicker of that first winter, nor even the deliberate warmth of the ballroom where he had claimed her before the whole county. It was something steadier than either, the particular, settled smile of a man who has stopped merely surviving his own life, and has, at long last, in the company of a woman who never once bowed to him, for the sake of bowing, begun to properly live it.